Between 1847 and 1851, 9 plantation owners across central Alabama were found dead in their beds, each with the same gruesome injury, a crushed windpipe. There were no signs of a struggle, and each bedroom door was locked from the inside. What terrified the local slaveholders most was this single, repeating detail. The 9 men collectively owned more than 400 enslaved people, yet investigators noticed something odd in their estate ledgers. Every one of them had recently purchased or traded for an unusually tall field hand, identified only as Jacob. No surname, no recorded age, just Jacob. But there was more that never appeared in official reports. 7 of the 9 victims had their tongues severed after death and placed into their own hands. The remaining 2 were discovered with cotton, still attached to the bowl, crammed into their mouths. Local newspapers blamed it on a mysterious, nighttime apoplexy. The planters, however, knew better. Someone, or something, was hunting them, and there was no way to stop it. Before we go further into the story of Big Jacob and the wave of terror that swept through Alabama's plantation belt, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button. What you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse basements and sealed family records for more than 170 years. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I want to see how far this story reaches. The investigation into these strange deaths would eventually involve 3 sheriffs, 2 federal marshals, and more than 60 armed vigilantes. Yet not one person was ever arrested. What they uncovered instead forced them to face a truth darker than anything they could have imagined. In the decade before the Civil War, Lowndes County, Alabama, was a place where cotton ruled and human lives were treated as currency. Its fertile black soil produced some of the richest cotton in the South, and the men who owned that land held power that stretched well beyond their plantations. They dominated state politics, controlled county courts, and decided fates with a casual cruelty that would shock even the most jaded observer today. The plantation corridor between Montgomery and Selma was dotted with grand estates, each functioning like a private kingdom. Men such as Cornelius Vaughn, Thaddeus Reinhardt, and Josiah Grantham owned not only the land and enslaved people, but also the machinery and businesses that kept the region running. They financed railroads, operated cotton gins, and held mortgages over smaller farms. A single word from them to the right banker in Mobile could destroy a man's life. But in the summer of 1847, something began to change in Lowndes County. A giant of a man, impossibly tall for the era, started appearing at slave markets and private sales throughout the area. Accounts varied, but witnesses described him as standing between 6'9" and 7'2", with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to pass through most doors. His skin was dark mahogany, his hands enormous, and his eyes pale gray, a detail nearly every record emphasized. According to a Savannah auction document dated June 12, 1847, his name was listed simply as Jacob. The paper estimated his age around 28, though the auctioneer noted it was only a guess since the man refused to speak. The word mute appeared twice underlined in the margin. The buyer that day was Cornelius Vaughn, owner of Sweet Gum Plantation, a 200-acre estate about 12 miles south of Hayneville. Vaughn paid $150 for Jacob, nearly double the typical price for a skilled field hand, but he believed the purchase was worth every penny. A man of Jacob's size could outwork 2 average laborers, and his silence was seen as a blessing. A slave who couldn't talk couldn't conspire, spread rebellion, or bear witness. Vaughn brought Jacob back to Sweet Gum in chains, though witnesses later said the shackles were mostly for appearance. Jacob walked calmly, his enormous frame moving with an unsettling grace. The 93 enslaved men, women, and children already living on the plantation watched him arrive with a mixture of fear and awe. What Vaughn couldn't have known was that Jacob had already been sold 6 times in the previous 14 months. Each buyer had been a wealthy planter. Each man had died not long after the purchase. And every time it was the widow or surviving family, not the buyer himself, who returned Jacob to market. The pattern was obvious in hindsight, scattered across ledgers in 3 states, but no one had ever pieced it together. No one had asked why such a valuable worker kept being resold, or what happened to the men who bought him. Sweet Gum Plantation was one of Lowndes County's crown jewels in 1847. Its Greek Revival mansion with 6 grand columns stood as a testament to wealth built on human suffering. Cornelius Vaughn lived there with his wife, Margaret, their 4 children, and Margaret's elderly mother. The household also included 3 white overseers, 2 light-skinned house servants, and nearly 100 field hands divided into labor gangs by strength. Vaughn, at 52, was a second-generation planter whose father had come from South Carolina in 1818. Among white society, he was seen as stern but fair, meaning only that he used the whip less often than others. He was a church-going man, a county commissioner, and a 2-time state legislator. But among the enslaved, Vaughn's reputation was far darker. He was known as a destroyer of spirits, a man who delighted in breaking those who showed courage or pride. He intentionally split up families, believing isolation kept rebellion at bay. Jacob was placed in the first field gang, the strongest laborers who toiled from before sunrise until long after sunset during cotton season. During his first week at Sweet Gum Plantation, Jacob picked more cotton than any 3 men combined. By his second week, the overseer, a man named Randall Peake, made a fatal assumption that Jacob's silence meant obedience. Peake struck him across the back with a hickory cane for pausing too long during a water break. It was a routine punishment, the kind delivered daily on plantations across the South, but Jacob's reaction was far from ordinary. He froze. He didn't cry out, he couldn't, being mute, but he slowly turned his head and fixed those pale gray eyes on Peake. The stare lasted only a few seconds, yet it was enough to drain the color from the overseer's face. Peake would later admit that in that brief moment, something primal gripped him, a terror that made his stomach twist. He never laid a hand on Jacob again. The other slaves soon began to notice strange things about the silent giant. He never joined them for meals. Each evening, he would take his portion of cornmeal and salt pork and disappear into the woods at the plantation's edge, only to return long after darkness had fallen. Some of the elders whispered that he prayed out there. Others believed he was plotting something. A few, in hushed voices, claimed he was remembering. On the night of September 3, 1847, 83 days after Jacob's arrival, Cornelius Vaughn went to bed at his usual hour of 10 o'clock. His wife Margaret had retired earlier with a headache. The house was quiet, the children slept upstairs, and Margaret's elderly mother snored softly in her ground floor room. At dawn, Margaret entered the master bedroom and found her husband dead. The sight would haunt her until her own death 4 decades later. Cornelius lay flat on his back, eyes bulging, his skin a mottled purple, grey she first mistook for shadow. His mouth gaped open in what looked like a silent scream. His tongue gone, severed neatly at the root. The missing tongue had been carefully placed in his right hand, folded over his chest. But the true horror lay in his throat. Though the skin showed no mark, the damage beneath was devastating. The examining physician later wrote that the hyoid bone was crushed, the thyroid cartilage shattered, and the larynx compressed so completely it had nearly flattened against the spine. He noted that such destruction would require force far beyond human strength. The door to the bedroom had been locked from the inside, the key still in the lock. Every window was latched. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, not even rumpled sheets. The only anomaly was the cotton. 7 cotton bowls, still attached to bits of stem and leaf, were arranged in a semicircle on the pillow near Cornelius's head. Margaret never kept raw cotton inside the house. Whoever had placed it there had brought it in from outside. The investigation was brief and superficial. Sheriff Thomas Braddock arrived by mid-morning with 2 deputies. They questioned the family, the overseers, and a few house slaves. Each gave the same answer: they had heard nothing in the night. The sheriff concluded that Cornelius had likely suffered an apoplectic fit, biting through his tongue and crushing his own throat during a seizure. It was an implausible explanation, but it spared everyone from admitting the alternative, that someone had entered a locked room and killed one of the most powerful men in the county without a sound. 3 days later, Vaughn's funeral drew half the county, including every major planter within 20 miles. As tradition demanded, the Sweet Gum slaves lined the roadside, heads bowed as the procession passed. Jacob stood at the rear, towering above the others even from several yards behind. Unlike the rest, he did not bow. He simply watched, his gray eyes unblinking, his massive hands relaxed at his sides. 3 weeks after her husband's death, Margaret Vaughn sold Jacob to a planter named Thaddeus Reinhardt, owner of Fair Hope Plantation, a 500-acre estate about 30 miles east in Montgomery County. She accepted $600 for him, a considerable loss from the original price, but she wanted him gone. Rumors had begun to spread among the enslaved workers that Jacob was somehow responsible for Cornelius's death, though no one could explain how. The whispers unsettled her. Reinhardt, on the other hand, was thrilled. He had heard stories of the enormous mute who could pick cotton faster than any man alive. For $600, he thought he had struck a bargain. Jacob was set to work immediately and once again outperformed everyone in the fields. Reinhardt was 60, a widower with 3 grown sons who managed parts of the estate. He was notorious for his cruelty. Quick with the whip and inventive with punishment, a slave who angered him might lose half his rations, be forced to labor in leg irons, or be denied the Sabbath's single day of rest. Jacob worked in silence, enduring everything without reaction, which only seemed to feed Reinhardt's contempt. The planter took pleasure in humiliating him, ordering him to kneel when spoken to, forcing him to bow before white guests, even striking him across the face for the smallest imagined slight. Then, on the night of October 27, 1847, Thaddeus Reinhardt went to bed alone in his second-floor chamber. Reinhardt slept in the main house's second-floor bedroom. His sons lived in separate cottages on the property, each overseeing a different section of the estate. Aside from Reinhardt, the main residence housed only 2 elderly house slaves who slept in a lean-to attached to the kitchen, apart from the main building. The next morning, one of Reinhardt's sons arrived for breakfast and found his father dead. The scene mirrored Sweet Gum exactly, a crushed windpipe, no signs of a struggle, and the bedroom locked from the inside. This time there was no severed tongue. Reinhardt's mouth had been jammed full of raw cotton, so much that his cheeks were puffed and his jaw forced wide. Cotton fibers were embedded deep in his throat, but the physician's examination made clear that suffocation had not caused the death. The throat had been destroyed first. The cotton was added afterward. News of the second killing spread quickly. Within days, the planter class across central Alabama knew of the 2 murders and the eerie parallels. Sheriff Braddock went to Fair Hope to investigate in person, and it was there that someone finally noticed the connection everyone should have seen earlier. Both men had recently owned a slave named Jacob. Both had died within weeks of acquiring him. The bill of sale found in Reinhardt's study showed Jacob had been purchased from Cornelius Vaughn's widow. Braddock ordered that Jacob be found and questioned at once. When the overseer checked the slave quarters that evening, the giant mute was gone. His pallet in the cabin he shared with 8 other men lay empty. No one had seen him leave, no one heard him depart. He had simply vanished sometime between sunset and full dark. A search party formed immediately. 20 mounted men with tracking dogs from a neighboring plantation scoured the woods and fields around Fair Hope for 3 days. They turned up nothing. No footprints, no trail, no indication of which way Jacob had gone. Braddock, however, was meticulous, and the case gnawed at him. If Jacob was the killer, and the circumstantial evidence strongly suggested he was, why had he been sold repeatedly? Why had Vaughn's widow allowed a murderer to be bought and sold? Braddock began tracing Jacob's past, requesting records from auction houses and plantations across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. What he uncovered chilled him. In the previous 18 months, Jacob had been sold 9 times. In 8 of those sales, the purchaser had died within 12 weeks. The lone exception was a small Georgia farmer who bought Jacob and then sold him 2 weeks later after confessing the man made him uneasy. That farmer remained alive. 8 dead men, 8 identical causes of death, though the incidents were spread over a broad area, so no one had tied them together earlier. 8 locked rooms, 8 crushed throats, and in 7 of those 8 cases some mutilation of the tongue or mouth. Braddock assembled his report and sent it to the governor's office in Montgomery, urging immediate action. He described Jacob precisely, his towering height, pale gray eyes, absolute silence, and warned the man was probably still in Alabama, likely still killing. The response from Montgomery was blunt and immediate: find Jacob and hang him, but do it quietly. With tensions over slavery already high in 1847, the state wanted to avoid a public spectacle of a slave who had killed white men and then vanished, an event that would alarm the enslaved population and unsettle white households, an outcome, one official put it, that would undermine the natural order. Thus the hunt for Beg Jacob, as the rumors named him, was run as quietly as possible. Rewards were posted in county courthouses but not advertised in papers. Descriptions circulated among sheriffs and slave patrols but were not released to the general public. Plantation owners across central Alabama began taking precautions, locking bedroom doors, keeping pistols by their beds, and posting trusted house slaves outside bedrooms at night. None of it mattered. The winter of 1847 was among the coldest on record for Alabama. Ice storms in December glazed the cotton fields in a shimmering crust that made the landscape almost picturesque, if one could ignore the suffering beneath. Work slowed. Enslaved people huddled in unheated cabins, burning whatever wood they could spare to stay warm. In the plantation great houses, white families drew nearer to their hearths and wondered if the silent killer prowled the frozen dark. 3 months passed without another death, and Braddock allowed himself to hope Jacob had fled the state or perished in the woods. Not an unusual fate for fugitives unfamiliar with survival in harsh terrain. Then on February 9, 1848, planter Josiah Grantham was found dead in his bed at Elmwood Plantation in Dallas County. Same crushed throat, same locked door, same cotton bowls arranged around his head. Grantham owned 112 enslaved people, and his latest ledger entry showed a field hand acquired just 6 weeks earlier in a private sale. The seller was listed as E. Reinhardt, one of Thaddeus Reinhardt's sons, disposing of assets after his father's death. The slave's name Jacob. The pattern could no longer be denied. Jacob was not fleeing, he was circulating. He allowed himself to be bought and sold from plantation to plantation, killing each new owner, disappearing and then reappearing on another farm where he would be sold again. How he orchestrated these sales, how he arranged to be sent to particular estates, and how he moved between properties without leaving a trail remained a mystery, but the fact remained undeniable. What kept Braddock tossing and turning into the small hours was the method. How was Jacob slipping into locked chambers? How could he kill these men without waking them, without signs of a struggle or a cry? And above all, why? What motive could explain such cold, precise slayings? The answer came from an unexpected quarter, an elderly enslaved woman named Bethany, who lived on a modest Perry County plantation. Bethany was known across the region as a healer and a repository of old stories. At roughly 80 years old, an extraordinary age for an enslaved person then, she had been born in West Africa and carried to South Carolina as a child aboard a slave ship. When news of the murders reached her county, Bethany asked to see the local sheriff. It was an odd move. Slaves rarely volunteered information to white officials. Yet Bethany was respected even by whites for her medicinal skills, and the sheriff consented to meet her. Bethany told him she remembered a boy like Jacob decades earlier in South Carolina. He had been only 7 or 8 then, already strikingly tall for his age. His mother came from a region in West Africa noted for tall people. His father, Bethany said, had been the white overseer of that plantation, a cruel man named Samuel Colton who took what he wanted from enslaved women without remorse. The boy, Bethany recalled, had been called Jacob with a K and had been born mute. He could not speak, but he was not deaf or slow. He saw and understood everything. Bethany said he learned young that his silence rendered him invisible to whites, who spoke freely in his presence, never thinking he would remember. When Jacob was 10, his mother died under suspicious circumstances, found at the foot of the stairs from the overseer's house. Colton claimed she had fallen while bringing him breakfast. Nobody believed him, but none dared confront him. 3 days later, Colton was found dead in his bed, his throat crushed in a manner no one could explain. The boy was sold away immediately. The plantation owner wanted no reminders of what had happened. Bethany lost track of the boy after that, but over the years heard rumors. A mute giant moving from plantation to plantation, arriving shortly before some man's sudden death. Some swore he was cursed, others said he was a spirit. Bethany believed something else, that he had learned a way to kill, then chosen to use that skill to settle old scores. Braddock listened to Bethany with mounting dread. If she was right, Jacob was not random, he was seeking out certain men, overseers and owners who wielded cruel power over the enslaved. Men Jacob judged worthy of death. But the how remained. Even a man of Jacob's size would struggle to enter a locked room and kill without noise. The key clue came from an unlikely witness, 7-year-old Thomas Grantham, the son of Josiah Grantham. The boy had been plagued by nightmares since his father's murder. Visions of shifting shadows and something vast and silent standing over his bed. His mother chalked it up to grief until one evening, 3 weeks after the killing, Thomas said he had seen Jacob in the hallway outside his father's room on the night of the murder. But Jacob, the child insisted, was not walking. He was crawling along the ceiling. Thomas's mother dismissed the tale as a frightened child's fancy, but she mentioned it to the sheriff when he called. Braddock took it seriously and returned to Elmwood to inspect the corridor anew. The house's ceilings were lofty, about 12 feet high in the main hall, the long passage lined with doors on either side. Looking up, Braddock noticed faint impressions on the ceiling beams, small, regular depressions, as if something heavy had been pressed against them. The marks ran from the servants' staircase at the far end straight to Grantham's bedroom door. Braddock stood there a long while, puzzling it over, then climbed the narrow servants' stair. Above that stairwell the ceiling was lower, perhaps 9 feet high instead of 12. A man of Jacob's extraordinary height and reach, Braddock realized, could in theory brace himself between the stairwell's opposing walls, using hands on one side and feet on the other, and push himself upward without ever setting foot on the treads. From that position he could continue along the hallway by pressing his limbs against opposite walls, effectively moving suspended above the floor. It seemed impossible. The strength needed would be superhuman. Yet every detail of Jacob, his bulk, his silence, his patience, hinted at capacities beyond the ordinary. If he could traverse the ceiling, he could station himself directly above a closed door and wait, motionless, for hours if necessary. And when that door finally opened, when his victim rose in the night for water or to use the chamber pot, Jacob would descend like a spider from the ceiling, crushing the man's throat before a single sound could escape, then dragging the lifeless body back to the bed to arrange the scene. The locked doors had never mattered. Jacob had never needed to unlock them. He had been inside all along, waiting above the doorframe, where no one ever thought to look. Just when you think this tale can't grow any darker, consider this: if Jacob could move unseen through the most secure parts of these grand plantation houses, how many nights had he silently watched these families sleep? How many times had he hovered above their beds, deciding who would die and who would live? The terror that gripped Lowndes County wasn't just about the murders themselves. It was the realization that Big Jacob could have struck anyone, anywhere, at any time. No bolt, no firearm, no guard could have stopped him. If this story sends a chill down your spine, share it with someone who loves the shadows of history. Tap the like button to help our channel grow, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Because what comes next is even more unsettling than you imagine. Sheriff Braddock's theory about Jacob's method, how he entered and killed, was shared with a select circle of lawmen and plantation owners in March 1848. Their reaction mixed disbelief with dread. Disbelief because the strength and agility required seemed beyond human limits. Dread because, if Braddock was right, then every bedroom in Alabama was vulnerable. Precautions followed. Ceilings were checked for marks. Halls were patrolled through the night. Some planters even sealed the gaps around their doors with rags or added more locks, hoping to feel safe. But all of it was futile, rooted in a false assumption. They believed Jacob struck soon after being purchased, as he had with Cornelius Vaughn and Thaddeus Reinhardt. For the first few weeks, new owners stayed alert. Then time passed, nothing happened, and they relaxed. Jacob had adapted. He had learned to wait. His next target, William Sturdivant of Wilcox County, owned Jacob for 4 full months before the inevitable. On June 12, 1848, Sturdivant was found dead in his locked bedroom. He had done everything right. Examined the ceiling weekly, kept pistols within reach, and had his most trusted house servant, an elderly man named Moses, sleep on a pallet outside his door. None of it saved him. When morning came, Moses awoke to find his master dead. Cotton bowls were arranged neatly around the corpse's head. The man's tongue had been cut out and placed in his hand. Fresh indentations marked the ceiling beams, marks that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. Jacob had entered silently, positioned himself above the room, and waited for his moment to strike. The death of William Sturdivant marked a turning point. Any hope of capturing Jacob alive began to fade. He was no ordinary fugitive. He was cunning, patient, and absolutely devoted to his mission. Governor Reuben Chapman, facing panic among Alabama's elite, authorized a special patrol solely dedicated to hunting Jacob down. 20 armed men were recruited, veteran slave catchers led by a ruthless bounty hunter named Marcus Pettigrew. The reward for Jacob, dead or alive, was raised to $5,000, an enormous sum, reflecting both the fear and desperation gripping the planter class. Pettigrew, a lean, hard-eyed man in his early 40s from Tennessee, had spent 2 decades tracking runaways. He bragged that he'd captured over 300 fugitives and never failed once. His cruelty was infamous, but no one cared. They wanted results. Pettigrew began by studying every detail of Jacob's trail. He gathered bills of sale, mapped Jacob's movements through Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and interviewed anyone who had ever seen the mute giant. A clear pattern emerged. Jacob wasn't acting on impulse. He was following a deliberate design. Every man he'd killed shared traits. They were wealthy plantation owners, notorious for cruelty, for breaking families apart, for dealing in human lives without mercy. And there was another link. Many of them had personal or business ties to one man, Samuel Colton, the overseer who had died in South Carolina 4 decades earlier. Records showed Colton had not only overseen slaves, but traded them on the side for profit. Several of Jacob's victims had once bought enslaved people from him, people Colton had acquired, through methods so brutal that even other traders had questioned them. Bethany's old story of the mute boy, Jacob, whose mother died suspiciously under Colton's watch, now took on chilling new weight. If Colton had been complicit in her death, and if Jacob's victims had been his associates, then Jacob wasn't just murdering at random. He was finishing something he'd started long ago. He was crossing names off a list. For 40 years, Jacob had been executing a plan. Pettigrew quickly realized that to capture Jacob, he would have to think like him, anticipate his next move instead of reacting to his last. He began by tracking who might be next on Jacob's silent list. Using old records from slave trading firms that had done business with Samuel Colton during the 1820s and 1830s, Pettigrew cross-referenced the names with living plantation owners across Alabama. 11 names surfaced. 8 of those men were already dead. The remaining 3 were Nathaniel Harwick of Butler County, Isaiah Drummond of Choctaw County, and Preston Dean of Marengo County. All 3 were immediately alerted and placed under guard. Pettigrew divided his patrol into 3 teams, assigning one to each estate. For 6 tense weeks, nothing happened. The planters began to relax, convincing themselves Jacob had either fled Alabama or perished in the wilderness. Pettigrew's men grew restless, drinking at night and sleeping through their shifts. Then, on August 2, 1848, Nathaniel Harwick was discovered dead in his bed. The signs were unmistakable: throat crushed, door locked from the inside, cotton balls arranged neatly around the head, and the tongue severed and placed in both hands, folded as if in prayer. The patrol guarding his property swore they had been vigilant. No one had entered or exited the house. They had inspected every door and window, and even checked the hallway ceiling twice during the night. Yet Jacob had killed again. The realization struck Pettigrew like a hammer blow. Jacob had been inside before they ever arrived. He had hidden himself somewhere within the house, waiting patiently for the right moment. He had the discipline to stay motionless for days if necessary. And somehow, he knew these plantation houses better than the men who owned them. But how? The answer came from a ledger found in Harwick's study. It listed all his slaves by name, age, and work assignment. Under recent acquisitions, an entry dated June 20, 1848, Rady, Jacob male, approximately 30 years old, Mutefield hand, purchased from W. Sturdivant Estate, sailed 400 dive. Jacob had been living on Harwick's plantation for 6 weeks, working in the fields by day, sleeping in the quarters by night, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. When the patrol set up watch, Jacob had simply concealed himself somewhere inside the main house, perhaps in the attic, perhaps a storage room, and waited for their guard to drop. Pettigrew finally understood what he'd been missing. Jacob wasn't fleeing from one plantation to another. He was moving through them deliberately, using the slave system as his cover. He wasn't hiding from the institution. He was hiding inside it. He was invisible because he was right where everyone expected him to be, laboring in the fields, sleeping in the quarters, blending perfectly into the background of Southern life. And when the time came, he used that access to strike. It was horrifying in its brilliance. Harwick's murder sent waves of panic through Alabama's planter class, far worse than any before. The realization that no lock or guard could keep them safe, that Jacob could already be working on their own land without their knowledge, spread terror like wildfire. Owners began scrutinizing their slaves for anyone unusually tall, too quiet, too watchful, or recently acquired. Several men who faintly resembled Jacob were arrested and tortured for answers, but none were him. Isaiah Drummond of Choctaw County took the most extreme precautions. He ordered a doctor to inspect every slave on his property, searching for the pale gray eyes witnesses described. He dismissed all 3 of his overseers and replaced them with outsiders, fearing Jacob might have influenced the old ones. Drummond abandoned his plantation house entirely, moving into a hotel in the nearby town of Butler. He visited his property only in daylight, always surrounded by armed guards. Preston Dean of Marengo County took a different approach. He announced he would sell everything: his land, equipment, livestock, and all 147 enslaved people, and leave Alabama for good. The estate sale was scheduled for September 15, 1848, with advertisements in newspapers across the South. Buyers arrived early to inspect the slaves and place advance bids. Among those listed for sale was a field hand named Jacob. Dean had purchased him 8 months earlier from the estate of William Sturdivant, the very man found dead in June. At the time, Dean hadn't made the connection, but after hearing of Harwick's murder, he reviewed his records and realized the horrifying link. He immediately sent word to Pettigrew. Pettigrew and his 20-man patrol reached Dean's plantation on September 10th. They found Jacob in the cotton fields, working with steady, mechanical precision, his immense frame bent over the rows. When the men approached, Jacob straightened and looked at them. Those unmistakable pale gray eyes met Pettigrew's, expressionless and cold. The bounty hunter had come prepared. His men carried heavy iron shackles, chains strong enough to restrain any man alive. But as they surrounded Jacob and moved to seize him, something unexpected happened. Jacob didn't run, he didn't fight. He simply stood still, waiting. And when the first man reached for his wrist, Jacob did something that made the entire patrol recoil in instinctive fear. He smiled. It wasn't a natural smile. It stretched his mouth in a way that looked wrong, as if the muscles of his face weren't used to the motion. As if he had studied the act of smiling from others, but never experienced the feeling himself. That eerie imitation of joy unsettled Pettigrew more deeply than any of the grisly scenes he had encountered. In that instant he understood. Jacob wanted to be caught. His capture was not an end, but a continuation of his plan. Maintaining his composure, Pettigrew ordered his men to secure Jacob, with iron restraints on his wrists and ankles, then fasten him to a thick post in the middle of Dean's stable yard, where he could be seen from every angle. Guards were assigned in rotating shifts with strict instructions. At least 4 men must have their eyes on Jacob at all times, and no one was ever to approach him alone. For 3 days, Jacob stood there in silence. He refused food and water. He neither spoke nor slept, or if he did, his eyes never closed. The men swore that his gaze remained fixed, unblinking, and that faint, unnatural smile never left his face. On the 3rd night, something occurred that would later be debated for generations. One of the sentries, Luke Ferris, claimed he saw Jacob's chains beginning to glow faintly in the darkness, not bright enough to light the yard, but with a dull ember, like red shimmer, as though the metal were warming from within. Ferris shouted for the others, and all 4 guards on duty confirmed seeing the same eerie light. By the time Pettigrew arrived, roused from his quarters, the glow had faded. But when he touched the chains, they were warm, and the links near Jacob's wrists showed fine cracks running through the iron. Pettigrew immediately ordered new restraints to be forged, links twice as thick as before, and doubled the guard, posting 8 men around the stable. At dawn on September 14th, 1 day before the planned estate sale, Pettigrew made his decision. There would be no trial, no chance for Jacob to become a symbol among the enslaved. He would be executed at first light in that same yard and buried in an unmarked grave. Word of the decision spread quietly through the slave quarters. By nightfall, a strange stillness hung over the plantation. Small groups gathered to whisper among themselves, their voices low and fearful. Overseers complained of unease they couldn't explain. Preston Dean, though already preparing to abandon Alabama, declared that he would stay 1 more night to witness Jacob's hanging. to see the end of this terror with his own eyes. That evening, he locked himself inside his bedroom, placed a loaded pistol by his bed, and drifted into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. Sometime in the dead of night, Dean awoke to crushing weight on his chest. Disoriented, he groped for his weapon but found only empty air. As his vision adjusted, he saw it, Jacob's massive form looming above him. The giant's pale grey eyes glimmered faintly in the moonlight, and his breath came slow and steady. His enormous hands encircled Dean's throat. Dean tried to scream, but no sound came. He struggled, but Jacob's grip was unyielding. Panic blurred thought. Jacob couldn't be here, he was chained, guarded. Yet here he was, his expression calm, almost serene. The last thing Dean saw before darkness claimed him was that same uncanny smile, stretching wider as the pressure on his neck crushed the final breath from his lungs. Meanwhile, in the stable yard, the guards kept their posts. Jacob stood motionless, chained exactly as before, eyes open and face unchanged. No one had seen him move. At dawn, Pettigrew arrived to prepare for the execution. The guards confirmed Jacob had been under constant watch all night. But when Pettigrew entered the main house to summon Dean, chaos erupted. Preston Dean was dead. Found in his locked bedroom with his throat crushed, 7 cotton balls placed neatly around his head, and his severed tongue resting in his folded hands. The discovery shattered any sense of logic. Jacob had been in full view the entire night. Every guard swore he hadn't moved an inch. Yet the unmistakable mark of his killings lay before them once again. As Pettigrew stood over Dean's body, a terrible realization struck him. Jacob hadn't killed this man, not with his own hands. Perhaps he had never killed any of them in the literal sense. But he was still at the center of it all, and the truth behind that connection was far darker than anything Pettigrew had imagined. Pettigrew felt a grim determination settle over him as he returned to the stable. Jacob still stood chained to the post exactly as before, silent, unmoving, that faint, ghost-like smile fixed on his lips. For 4 days, no one had dared address him directly, but Pettigrew decided to break the silence. "You didn't do it," he said quietly. "You couldn't have. But you know who did. You know how this is happening." Jacob's expression didn't change. Those pale grey eyes stared through him, cold and unreadable. The smile never faltered. Pettigrew tried another approach. "You're not alone. There are others. How many?" For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then Jacob slowly lifted his chained hands and raised 9 fingers. 9, Pettigrew's stomach turned. 9, the exact number of dead plantation owners. But what if it also meant 9 killers? 9 working together, connected somehow through Jacob. They were all here. Pettigrew muttered to himself, realization dawning. At Dean's sale, the buyers, the ones who came to inspect the slaves. They were your people, weren't they? One of them killed Dean while you kept everyone's attention on you. But Jacob lowered his hands, but his smile deepened ever so slightly, confirming Pettigrew's suspicion without a single word. "Round up everyone who attended the estate viewing this week." Pettigrew barked to his men. "Every buyer, every agent, every visitor. I want them all brought here. Now." It took most of the day, but by late afternoon 47 men stood crowded in Preston Dean's stable yard. Planters, traders, agents. Their faces red with anger and confusion. Many were wealthy, influential men unused to being questioned, and they shouted their outrage at Pettigrew's accusation. He ignored them. His men searched each man thoroughly, turning up nothing unusual, no weapons, no blood, no sign of guilt. But Pettigrew wasn't looking for evidence among them. He was looking for someone who moved unseen, someone who could enter any house unquestioned. "How many of you brought personal servants?" Pettigrew asked suddenly. "Body slaves, attendants who traveled with you." 13 hands went up. "I want to see all of them," he ordered. "Now, line them up." 13 enslaved men were brought forward, varying in age, size, and complexion. They stood silently, eyes lowered, while Pettigrew walked slowly down the line. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, only that he would recognize it when he saw it. Then he stopped. The 10th man in line was shorter than Jacob, perhaps 5'10", with lighter skin, but his eyes, pale grey identical to Jacob's, stopped Pettigrew cold. His hands, too, were unnaturally large, broad and powerful for a man his size. "What's your name?" Pettigrew asked. The man glanced toward his master, a planter named Ezekiel Finch of Montgomery County, before answering softly, "Samuel, sir." "Samuel what?" "Just Samuel, sir. I don't have another name." Pettigrew studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "Take off your shirt." The man hesitated, clearly uneasy, but obeyed. His torso was solid with muscle, and on his left shoulder was a brand burned deep into the flesh, the letters S.C. Samuel Colton. Pettigrew felt the blood drain from his face. "You were one of Colton's slaves," he said slowly. "And you survived." He took a step closer. "How many others survived?" Samuel didn't answer, but his eyes flickered toward Jacob, still chained at the post, and that was all the confirmation Pettigrew needed. The realization crashed over him like a wave. Jacob hadn't been working alone. He had been orchestrating something far larger. A network of slaves spread across several states, all linked by the same past. Each one had been owned, sold, or brutalized by Samuel Colton or the men who had done business with him. They had been communicating quietly for years, passing messages, arranging transfers, ensuring that when one of Colton's old associates bought new slaves, at least one of them would be among them. Jacob was the signal, the myth, the distraction. While everyone watched the silent giant, others, people like Samuel, did the killing. "Check the others," Pettigrew ordered hoarsely. "Look for the same brand. Look for the grey eyes. Any mark tied to Colton." By nightfall, they had identified 6 more. 6 of the 13 attendants bore Colton's brand or shared the strange pale eyes. 6 people who had infiltrated the plantations of Alabama, living unnoticed, waiting patiently for their time to strike. But that only made 7. Jacob had raised 9 fingers. Pettigrew soon realized with dread that the other 2 were still at large, and one of them had murdered Preston Dean. Interrogations began immediately. Pettigrew had the 7 captured suspects separated and questioned one by one, but none of them spoke a word. They stared back at their interrogators, some defiant, others blank and unfeeling, refusing to confirm or deny anything. Jacob, still chained where he stood, watched it all unfold with the same faint smile. He had achieved his goal. He had revealed the network. He had forced Alabama's white population to face a terrifying truth: that enslaved people could plan, communicate, and execute a coordinated campaign of targeted killings right under their masters' noses. The fear this realization spread turned out to be even more destructive than the murders themselves. That night, Pettigrew, Sheriff Braddock, and representatives from the governor's office held a tense meeting to decide Jacob's fate. The obvious choice was public execution, to hang them as a warning to others, but some warned against it. A public hanging meant a public explanation, and that explanation would expose how organized and far-reaching Jacob's network had truly been. It would reveal that enslaved men had killed 9 prominent white figures over 18 months without being caught. It would prove that the so-called stable slave system had been breached by those it sought to control. The psychological damage to Alabama's white citizens, and the South as a whole, could be catastrophic. The debate raged for hours before a decision was reached. Jacob and the 7 identified members of his circle would be executed in secret, their deaths attributed to disease. Cholera or typhoid, perhaps. Their bodies would be buried in unmarked graves. The last 2 members would be hunted down and eliminated quietly as well. As for the murders, they would be written off as natural deaths or blamed on unknown outlaws who had fled the state. Any public connection between the victims would be denied, and Jacob's name would be erased from all official records. It was a vast cover-up, driven not by justice but by fear. Fear of what the truth might awaken in 4 million enslaved people across the South. The executions were carried out on September 16, 1848, in a clearing 5 miles from Dean's plantation. Jacob and the 7 others were hanged one after another from a single oak tree. Their bodies were left hanging until nightfall, then buried together in a shallow grave. According to reports, Jacob never spoke, not a plea, not an explanation. He didn't resist as the noose tightened. He just scanned the faces of the men who came to watch him die, a faint, cold smile still on his lips. Then the trapdoor fell, and Big Jacob the Silent was gone. Through the fall and winter of 1848, the search for the remaining 2 conspirators continued. Pettigrew devoted months to tracking them, crossing Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, following whispers of tall men with gray eyes and unusually large hands. He captured one in January 1849 on a plantation in Clark County. The man was quietly hanged, his death disguised as an accident with farm machinery. The ninth member was never found. Pettigrew searched for 3 more years before giving up in 1852. Official county records across Lowndes, Dallas, and Wilcox were quietly altered. Death certificates listing unknown causes were changed to natural causes. Estate documents mentioning a slave named Jacob were edited or replaced with vague references. Old newspaper pages mentioning the killings were removed or reprinted with details omitted. The silence held firm. Within 10 years, the memory of Big Jacob had nearly vanished from public life. Those who remembered stayed quiet, either ordered to or too haunted by the truth to speak. Yet among the enslaved, the story endured. It passed from mouth to mouth, reshaped over time, but holding to its core a towering man without a voice, a hidden network striking back against their oppressors, and a campaign of justice the white world could neither stop nor comprehend. Some said Jacob had supernatural powers, that he could vanish, slip through walls, or that he had escaped death entirely. Others claimed he lived on in the north. Still others believed he was only one of many, that the network never died and continued its secret vengeance long after him. The truth, as history can best piece together, was simpler yet far more astonishing. Jacob, called Jacob even in childhood, was born into slavery around 1819 in South Carolina. His mother, an unusually tall woman taken from West Africa, had been among the last generation kidnapped before the slave trade's official ban in 1808. His father was Samuel Colton, a white overseer who had used his power to abuse her. Many enslaved women had suffered under Samuel Colton's control. Jacob's inability to speak was likely something he'd been born with. Perhaps a congenital defect, but what might have been a weakness became his greatest strength. White people often spoke freely around him, assuming that a man who could not talk must also lack intelligence, understanding, or even humanity. That arrogance gave young Jacob access to knowledge few enslaved children ever gained: the names of slave traders, the routes of the domestic slave trade, and the web of connections between plantation owners and the men who trafficked human lives. When his mother died, almost certainly murdered by Colton, though never proven, Jacob avenged her in the same manner he would perfect over the decades to come. Hiding in the attic space above Colton's room, he waited for him to sleep, dropped down silently, and crushed his throat before he could cry out. The boy was only 10. He was sold away immediately afterward, and spent the next 30 years moving through the slave system, studying its workings, learning who controlled it, and identifying others like himself, those who had suffered under Colton and his network, and who were willing to risk everything for revenge. The organization Jacob created was extraordinary for its precision and restraint. Its members did not lash out blindly or target random victims. They chose their marks carefully, men directly responsible for brutal acts, and executed them with methodical patience and coordination, making Jacob the visible member of the group, allowing him to be sold from plantation to plantation while others carried out the killings, was a deliberate strategy. His imposing size and muteness made him unforgettable, yet impossible to interrogate. By serving as the focus of attention, he diverted suspicion from the others who continued their mission in secret. The cotton bowls and severed tongues left at the scenes were not random. They were symbols, though their full meaning has been lost with time. Some historians suggest the cotton represented the crop that sustained slavery, while the tongues symbolized the stolen voices of the enslaved. Others believe the imagery was personal, connected to his mother or Colton's career as a trader. Whatever the truth, Jacob's campaign achieved its purpose. 9 men who had profited from Colton's operations were dead. Others, such as Isaiah Drummond, fled Alabama altogether, selling their slaves and abandoning their estates in terror. The economic damage was noticeable, small in scale, but enough to leave a mark on local records. Yet the greater impact was psychological. Even in its suppressed form, the legend of Big Jacob became part of the hidden lore of resistance. It showed that the system was not unbreakable, that through planning and unity, even the powerless could strike back. In the years before the Civil War, new incidents appeared across Alabama and nearby states. Planters found dead in locked rooms, their throats crushed, no signs of struggle. None were officially tied to Jacob's network, and historians can only guess whether they were carried out by survivors of his group or imitators inspired by the tale. Marcus Pettigrew, the bounty hunter who had captured Jacob, never returned to slave catching after 1849. He retired to Tennessee and farmed quietly until his death in 1867. Family stories claim that in his final years, he often woke in terror, convinced someone was watching him from the ceiling above his bed. Sheriff Thomas Braddock remained in Lowndes County until 1861, then fled to Texas to avoid Confederate service. He died 2 years later, reportedly of pneumonia, though whispers suggested a more violent end. Many of the plantations connected to the killings still stand today. Sweet Gum Plantation, where Cornelius Vaughn was killed, is now a bed and breakfast that makes no mention of its true past. Fair Hope burned mysteriously in 1852 and was never rebuilt. Elmwood, where Josiah Grantham died, operates as a museum, but its guides steer carefully around the events of 1848. None of these sites acknowledge Big Jacob or his rebellion. The plaques, museum texts, and polished stories of the Old South omit this chapter entirely, as though the silence begun in 1848 continues even now. Still, traces remain. The story survives through oral tradition, whispered in families and found in fragments, old courthouse ledgers, estate papers, or altered death certificates with details that don't add up. These scattered clues are all that remain of a history Alabama's white establishment tried desperately to erase. It is the story of a man who could not speak but found a way to make his voice echo through history. A man treated as property, who refused to be owned. Deemed less than human, he proved himself more intelligent, more patient, and far more dangerous than those who enslaved him. This story reminds us that the past we think we know is rarely complete, that the official record tells only a fraction of the truth, and that the most powerful acts of resistance are often the ones deliberately buried. What do you think? Was the full story of Jacob's network ever uncovered, or does more remain hidden? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves history's forgotten horrors.